Good afternoon, I'm Dean Mikkelsen, the editor of Oil and Gas Middle East, based here in Dubai. Today we are talking to Majid Jafar, the CEO of Crescent Petroleum, and also on the board of Dana Gas. So Majid, welcome.
Thank you, good to be here.
So what brought me to this interview today is you brought up something about the energy transition. Can you talk about the energy trilemma and the direction that we're going? Have we got enough infrastructure? What's the issue that you see?
So the energy trilemma, as it's come to be called, is about how to balance affordability, availability, and sustainability. These are like three legs of a stool, and there's often trade-offs between them. And it's a global challenge, of course. How do we maintain affordable and secure supplies of energy while we decarbonize the global energy system in order to tackle climate change? The concern is, in recent years, there's been a Western focus on the sustainability at the expense of the others, until last winter, when we had a crisis in Europe, when suddenly the issue of security of supply and affordability of supply became front and center again. Some policymakers were quick to blame the war in Ukraine. Actually, the rise in energy prices preceded that war by some months in Europe. And the concern I have, and that I was expressing at that meeting in Riyadh, was underinvestment in oil and gas, and particularly in natural gas, has meant that developing countries are burning more coal, in particular India and China, but also others like Indonesia and South Africa and Vietnam and others. And that is actually driving up emissions. So we're failing, in a sense, on all three legs of the stool. So we're ending up with price spikes, blackouts and energy shortages, as well as rising emissions over recent years. And that's despite all the global awareness, the global meetings like COP28, the trillions of dollars that have been spent on subsidizing renewable energy. As long as Asia today and then Africa tomorrow burns more coal for energy, we're going to be failing in that mission. And you can't blame these countries, because these are the countries, first of all, with a lower standard of living, that have every right to reach the standards of living of the 1 billion in the rich countries of the OECD. They have many other needs. The UN Sustainable Development Goals have defined those needs. Climate action is one of them. And if you're in a rich country, perhaps it's the only one that you feel. But if you are in the other 7 billion in the developing world, then clean water, health, education, poverty alleviation, all of these things are important. And secure and affordable energy is a fundamental prerequisite to achieving any of those.
And that's an interesting topic. You got to remember the leader of the Ugandan National Oil Company made a statement during COP28. She said that you're already asking us to transition, yet we haven't even started with petrol to fuel our vehicles. So how can we transition?
Yes, I mean, one of the African leaders in that meeting in Riyadh said, you're asking us to transition from nothing to what? How can we decarbonize when we have not yet carbonized?
Exactly.
And this is, an average African today, and of course Africa is seeing the largest growth in population by far of any continent in the world. The average African today uses 1/10 of the energy of the average European and 1/20 of the average American. So, some statistics like, the average African uses less energy than an American fridge alone, let alone everything else in the house. And we have still globally close to 1 billion people without any energy at all. And that number unfortunately rose during COVID. We were making progress there, and then COVID, actually it went the other way. and we have close to 3 billion people without clean cooking solutions. That means there might be basic electricity in many villages in Africa and in Asia, places like India, but people are still living in huts and cooking with either wood or dung. That is not only very high emissions, but the health impacts are terrible. The World Health Organization showed actually that millions are dying every year because of bad cooking solutions. Imagine you're in a small hut and you're cooking with these dirty fuels. The impact on lungs, on children, on health, it's actually killed more people during the years of the pandemic than COVID did itself. So it's a fundamental need. I would say it's a fundamental human right to energy, which we can't just take for granted. So we need a global energy system and policy that addresses those needs while we tackle the long-term sustainability challenges of climate change.
And it's a mix of policy and technology as well. But the technology is not fully there yet. And when you're looking ahead as natural gas being a transition fuel, there's that possibility as well, but that's not fully developed and structured.
Yeah, so if we look at the global energy mix, it's about 80% fossil fuels today, which is what it was 30 years ago when the word sustainability was first used at a UN meeting. What's important, though, is the mix within, the change within that fossil fuel mix. Coal is reducing. Actually, its consumption is still increasing, but the rate is reducing. It's expected to reduce faster than the others. Gas replacing coal has been the fastest driver down of emissions. It's how the US has achieved emissions levels of 30 years ago, or actually of 60 years ago per capita. It's how the UK has removed its need for coal and gone back to Victorian era, 19th century levels of emissions. And in general, it is the first step, should be the first step, is you replace dirtier fuel like coal with natural gas, which is half the emission, less than half the emissions and none of the NOx and the SOx, toxic, and then toxic emissions. And then you enable the addition of renewables. The problem with the renewables is intermittent. So you can't have it as your stable base load. You need something, to put it simply, when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, to back it up. And the UK recognized that very publicly only last week. The UK Energy Minister and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak writing an op-ed saying natural gas is fundamental to the transition, backing up intermittent renewables.
Because with renewables, we haven't even got enough storage or know how to store.
Exactly, you can't store it. Practically, you can't store it today. To store the energy of 1 barrel of oil, for example, would be, in weight, tons and tons and tons of batteries, and cost over $250,000 compared to barrel of oil, $80 today. So it's cost prohibitive to store. And this is something which is often missed when people say, oh, solar now is cheaper than gas. Yeah, but if it's only available 20% of the time, it's like saying I found the cheapest electrician in town, but he only works Mondays. So you need, assuming you need an electrician every day, which in the case of energy you do, then you need something for the rest of the week, and you have to take into account that cost. So the cleaner, first of all, there's no totally clean form of energy. The cleanest form is using less, more energy efficiency, and the UAE has made big strides there as well. But the cleaner forms to back up intermittent renewables are natural gas and nuclear. Unfortunately, a lot of Western climate activists have been against both. In fact, they started very anti-nuclear in the 60s and 70s because of association with weapons and safety concerns, even though actually nuclear has been much safer, statistically, than other forms of power. And then they were pro-gas until the US had the shale gas revolution, and now there's this lumping of gas in with the same bucket as fossil fuels. They're all bad and should be disinvested or discouraged. The danger with that is it's driving more burning of coal, as I said, particularly in developing countries. oil is majority produced by national oil companies today. So actually, you've got OPEC, you've got global markets or OPEC plus, and there is a balance. Natural gas is much more dependent on the private sector, and there's been an underinvestment in the hundreds of billions. I've seen, studies, it's about $300 billion a year underinvestment in the natural gas chain. And that is a big concern going forward in terms of achieving the objectives of the energy trilemma.
I believe that was even mentioned at a recent forum held in Algeria, at the gas exporters forum.
Yeah. So we've seen a big rise in global LNG. It's an area I used to work in Shell over 20 years ago, and we're expecting actually by 2040, the end of the next decade, a 50% increase in that market to 700 million tons a year. Obviously, Qatar is the major exporter from our region here. Australia is a major exporter in the Asia Pacific, but the number one today is now the United States. And that's an extraordinary transformation, because the United States used to be a market for LNG, and now it is the biggest producer of gas, the biggest consumer, the biggest exporter of natural gas. It's also the biggest producer of oil. And it's played a big role in meeting, I think 80% of the growth in oil demand last year was met by the United States. And I think that's often underappreciated when we hear US officials and how they speak about OPEC, or how they even speak about fossil fuels. Actually the US is the biggest leader and contributor in that sector.
It's a contradiction from what was happening in the 70s and the 80s and stuff like that.
Yes.
Because you're 100% right, they are now the largest producer of natural gas, and especially the shale revolution on the gas and the oils.
Yes, so
significant.
So there was this widely held view, as you know, that there's the peak oil, that we're going to run out. Although we've had numerous predictions,
that keeps moving ahead every 20 years.
And then I think the shale revolution, showing that with technology and enterprise, which the US led the way, and with its capital markets and so on, that actually we may have a lot more resources of oil and gas going forward than we thought we did, which are now producible commercially from these shale rocks. So then the dialogue shifted to, well, maybe it's not peak in terms of supply, but it's peak in terms of demand. We're not going to need it anymore. Again, whether peak, so oil demand is about 100 million barrels a day today. Whether it's peaked already and it's not going to grow anymore, or it's going to grow for the next 30, 40 years, and the debate is somewhere in that range, it's largely irrelevant, because what people forget about is the decline rate. We lose 5 to 7 million barrels per day of capacity annually just by the natural decline of old fields, which means you need to be investing just to maintain current production. There's this dangerous concept that it'll just produce on autopilot and keep producing. That's not the case. You still
all
need
fields
investment.
get old.
Absolutely.
And this is partly why fracking was introduced as well, to go partly into these older fields and revitalize them.
Yes.
And you had different other injection tools and water flooding to try to get more oil and gas out over time, even throughout the Middle East.
So most policymakers, certainly in Western countries, and even most consumers don't appreciate that. And also they don't appreciate the uses of oil and gas. There is this conception that somehow renewables can replace, first of all, renewables, if we're talking about solar and wind or even other forms, is about electricity provision. That's what they're there for. They can't do transportation, or we'll come to the electric cars and so on. For electricity provision, electricity today is 18% of global energy demand. So you still have 82%, which is used transportation, heavy industries, food, farming, etc., etc. So when we look at oil, people think of cars. They think of, I have an electric car, that's fine, I don't need oil anymore. Okay, but how is the electricity produced? If it's generated using coal, as it is most of the time in China and India, then an electric car might actually be worse for the climate change. It might be better for local pollution in the cities. Then you have trucking, shipping, air transportation, none of which today have an electric solution, nor is one imminent, let's say. And then the biggest driver in terms of growth of demand is actually making stuff, petrochemicals. So even in the energy transition, if it's solar panels, wind turbines, electric cars themselves, the tires, the interiors, the dashboards, the roads they drive on, everything is actually made of a lot of this stuff in the studio. What your viewers are watching this on as a device or a TV or even reading in a magazine. It's all dependent on oil, and people, again, don't appreciate that. I mean, what's the first thing we do when we wake up in the morning? We brush our teeth. So we put oil in our mouth twice. The toothbrush is made of oil, and so is the toothpaste. So is every medicine that is taken. All the vaccines we had during COVID used glycol as a stabilizing agent. People are not appreciating that. And then natural gas, on the other hand, is for power, but it's also a fundamental input for industry, and in particular for fertilizers, which is so vital for food production. So consumers in the UK and Europe were shocked in the winter when they saw suddenly supermarket shelves and issues, and they couldn't understand how the war in Ukraine was leading to shortages in this because of fertilizers, because of its impact on the food supply chain. People don't appreciate, a kilo of bread, you need quarter of a large bottle of crude oil, let's say. A kilo of chicken, it's about a third of a large bottle of crude oil. If you like seafood, that's more like half a bottle, because you've got to fish it. And
exactly.
People don't really appreciate how it's so fundamental to life. And so there's been this, in my view, dangerous demonizing of the sector, trying to blame it for climate change. The oil and gas sector doesn't burn oil and gas. It's all of human society and everything we do that depends upon the modern energy system. And we mustn't forget the modern energy system has led to a trebling of life expectancy, huge growth in population, huge feeding of the population, medicines, so many positives. We have this negative side effect, which is rising emissions, which is leading to global temperatures increasing, and we need to address that. But you don't throw out the good by trying to tackle the challenge.
So how would you say was your final message in this whole energy transition? What would you say to people listening?
So I think first of all, remembering the trilemma, remembering the moral and social and economic imperative of providing stable and affordable supplies of energy to the 6.5–7 billion people in the developing world. If the people in the rich countries, the OECD, wish to give up that modern energy system, and I've seen zero evidence that anybody is, by the way, but if they wish to give it up, that's absolutely fine. But you can't tell the developing world that they cannot expect a similar standard of living. So energy policy needs to be rational, needs to be balanced, needs to ensure we continue to supply those needs while doing so in a less carbon intensive manner. Just blaming oil and gas, for climate change, I say is like blaming farmers for obesity, and find, let's solve the obesity challenge by doing nothing about how we eat or diets, and let's just starve finance to farmers, and somehow that will solve the problem. I mean, that's essentially how a lot of this, the trends in Western countries have been. I think we're seeing a change now. We're seeing that it needs to be rational policy, that it needs to take into account energy security. And for me, first and foremost, is for the developing world. That's where the growth in population and energy demand, and therefore emissions, will also come. And meeting those needs in the right way is going to be core to this challenge.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.